Hello, everyone. So obviously the theme of today's conference is Detail Delivers. So we thought we'd take this as a bit of an opportunity to revisit some basics and also look forward to the future of where we might be going in some of the areas we're focusing on. Obviously, nitrogen's a really big one. It's something we very much sort of day to day, you think of your RECs, you probably do a very similar thing every year. But is there an opportunity to think about this in a bit more detail, refine it, maybe change what we're doing on farm? So today I'm just going to take you through some basic physiology of the crop. It's just a really good reminder. Most of you in the room will know it, but it's always nice to revisit it. Just a little bit about pH and thinking about how important pH is. Nitrogen in the crop, so what should we consider? Cover crop nutrient dynamics, which all of you would have heard me speak about on the podium earlier, but we'll just touch on that again. Fertilizer placement considerations, and also where we're going on that avenue as well. Alternative end products, there's a lot of those coming to market, so we'll just touch on those. And then finally, on-farm trials, which I've already spoken to you about, we'll just revisit. So a bit of a background, really. Canopy growth in sugar beet. So canopy growth in sugar beet is a nice, simple relationship. It's part of the reason I became a sugar beet scientist, because the real basic physiology is nice and straightforward and easy to understand. So the amount of light intercepted by the crop directly relates to yield and directly relates to sugar and dry matter. Very obvious thing to point out, but obviously in a lot of crops, you have to worry about developmental stages. You're worried about looking after your flag leaves, tillering numbers, all these sorts of other considerations. Whereas sugar beet is a relatively straightforward crop. It's maximize that canopy, maximize that light interception, maximize yield. We all know in practice, it's more challenging than that. There's a lot of things that stop that process from going as smoothly as we'd like. But overall, that's what we're thinking about. Why do we worry about this? Well, classic UK climates. This is Sutton Bonington, so near Nottingham. Typical solar radiation spread pattern through the year. Obviously, we peak in the summer and we drop off in the autumn and the winter. Hopefully, that's not a surprise to anyone here. What does that mean for sugar beet? Because of obviously the bolting risk for sugar beet and vernalisation challenges, we can't sow to sort of March time. That means we're a little bit behind intercepting that light and that peak radiation, sort of April, May time. But by June and July, we really want to have a big, well-established canopy that's maximising light interception and driving yield. What does this mean in actual numbers? That's all very well me pointing that out, sort of giving a wishy-washy overview. It means that we want a target of a leaf area index of 3 by the 3rd week in June. So leaf area index is the amount of leaf per metre squared of ground. So you want 3 metres squared of leaf over 1 metre squared of ground. If we get to that point, 95% of our light is being intercepted, we will be on the path to maximal yield and maximal growth. Part of that is optimizing nitrogen to make sure we reach this target. Why do I mention nitrogen? Well, nitrogen is really important for the rate of canopy expansion, but as we know, there's a lot of other factors that I won't cover today that feed into it, but we should think about. So the whole reason we have our sowing dates and trying to get as early as possible is to get that green cover. Plant populations, the magical 100,000 plants per hectare, feeds into that, maximising that leaf area index, getting that leaf area index of 3 by summer solstice, by mid-June. That's really important. Then, as I've just mentioned, nitrogen, but also temperature. We can't control temperature, but we can control our nitrogen rates. Then later in the season, thinking about canopy duration, so making sure our plant protection regimes are where they should be. We've got good timely control of any fungicides and pests. Going a little bit earlier in the season, I've done this in slightly the wrong order, is weed pressure as well. So earlier in the season, making sure that we're suppressing weeds. We've got good weed control so that we're making sure that beet is establishing nice and evenly and we get, again, that leaf area index. And finally, I will touch on variety. It's not that variety affects overall yield or that leaf area figure. There's just some things that I want to point out. So nitrogen in the sugar beet crop. You'll all be familiar with nitrogen deficiency. It doesn't tend to be the primary condition. It's very rare, really, in this country that nitrogen is so deficient that we actually see deficiency symptoms. So this is a pale canopy, your outer leaves dying and wilting. And then in really severe cases, which you just won't see in the UK, but sometimes we get in controlled environments, you get really long petioles of really small leaves, like lollipops, on the plant. What we do tend to actually end up with is nitrogen deficiency because of another problem. So nematode feeding damage is reducing nitrogen uptake, then you'll get the nitrogen deficiency symptoms. But it's very rare that we get nitrogen deficiency to a level where it's that obvious in the UK. It tends to be either another underlying condition or a different nutritional deficiency in a well-managed crop. So that's not enough nitrogen. What if we put too much on? So large amounts of nitrogen, and there's big data sets that show this, decrease the amount of plant that's storage root. So we end up with too much root, not enough shoot. And they also decrease the cells which actually accumulate sugar in the root, because the plant isn't having to conserve or store energy for the future. It's got enough nutrition, it's growing well. It will actually suppress your sugars. So optimizing nitrogen is really important. It's not like other crops where you tend to sort of get this constant linear relationship. Putting the right amount on to get that balance between root yield and sugar accumulation is really important. Some classic pictures here of what I've just mentioned. So these plants have been over-fertilized, we've got too much top and not enough root. And we do see it more than you'd expect. It is worth going out and just having a look at how your tops are growing and performing, because you might be over-fertilizing your crop. What does the crop actually need? So when I say typically, we're sort of working at a 75 tonne per hectare yielding crop. Typically, that would require 220 kilos of N over the entire season to optimize all the things I've spoken about. But it's important to remember that obviously doesn't all come from the bag. You know that here. You're not driving around throwing 220 kilos of N on. Where that actually comes from is you'll have 60 kilos of N available through mineralization in the season. You'll have 60 kilos already available, which you use in your RB209 calculation for your SMN. And finally, you'll normally put about 100 to 120 kilos of N on, again, depending on doing your assessments and your soil types, and weather, etc. So that equates to about 240 kilos of N per hectare, so more than enough to maximize yield. I always go on about the 120 kilos of N. We often get the question, is that still up to date? Obviously, varieties in sugar beet change all the time. There's a big turnover of varieties, changing in climates. The fact that yields are often constantly increasing. Is 120 kilos still enough? Yes, it is. Most recent work we've done was 2017, which I realize is a bit of a while ago now, but nothing has changed fundamentally enough that would make any adjustment to the nitrogen curve. So that 120 kilos of N is still very much the maximum nitrogen rate recommendation that we'd go with. So that's all well and good. Most of you will be pretty familiar. You probably sat here now almost knowing how much N you're going to put on your crop. But as things change, as we use sort of more organic manures in our rotation, more cover crops, which I spoke about a lot earlier, if you've got pastures or lays in your rotation, if you've had any previous issues with crops, any nutritional challenges, for example, with cereals, it could be if you've had excess lodging, that might highlight that you've got more N there than you think. Any big variations in soil texture obviously has an impact as well. And finally, this is very apt for the yeast growers. If you've got outdoor pigs as well, it's commonly suggested that actually measuring and going out and actually doing an SNS measurement is a better place to go rather than just using your books. So what about late season nitrogen? A really common question that we get. I often joke that we sort of don't give definitive answers always. There's always an if, a but, or a caveat. Late season N is really not required. There's a lot of data that shows it's just not necessary. The mineralization you'll be getting later into the season will be enough to be maintaining that canopy. So it's not something to think about. What we do need to focus on instead is really making sure our fungicide regimes and we're protecting that canopy that's already there. I'll touch on it in a bit. As well, there's some varietal considerations there, which I'll mention in a second. So yeah, this is a summary of that. So let's focus on our fungicides. That's really going to be what's maximizing our canopy greenness, maximizing that light interception as well, not thinking about putting late season nitrogen on, which might also be driving and actually suppressing your sugars rather than being beneficial. So the big question we often get is variety. What about variety? What do I need to consider? So there's a lot more variety now in sugar beet. Canopy architecture, you'll see it if you come to our open days, and I would encourage you to come and have a look. We drill out obviously all the recommended list varieties, and you can really compare and contrast them right next to each other. Some do grow more upright and some are flatter these days, and the two pictures up there really show that. So the one on your left is a flatter variety, the one on your right is a more upright variety. This doesn't have a significant impact on what I was saying about reaching that leaf area index of 3. The same principles still apply. They still perform just as well. It might just be that the more upright variety is technically slower to get total ground cover, but actually what it's achieving is the same. So just something to bear in mind and not to worry about. And the canopy curve on the left shows that. They can be a bit slower at getting to where they need to getting to that canopy closure, but it isn't something to worry about. They need to be treated the same. This also takes us on to canopy colour, and this picture's come out really nicely. So this is one of our demo fields. These are all the different varieties drilled out. And you can see there's a big difference in canopy greenness between the different strips, particularly the lighter one we've got in front of us and the darker one to the left. Just something to bear in mind that is not nutritional. That is just an inherent genetic difference. Obviously on farm, you won't have that direct contrast. But it might be worth, if you are a bit concerned about your canopy being lighter or not as dark as you'd expect, just considering that it might be a varietal difference. And again, come to the beet field open days and you can probably look at your variety on farm versus all the other varieties available, and just check that it's how you expect it to be. So going back to basics, the reason we mention pH is because it's quite surprising how many people's pH is not where we'd like it to be. Obviously, can change quite quickly, can be affected by a whole host of things if you're applying manures. Lots of rotational considerations, something we really need to think about. Sugar beet's a great point in the rotation to look at pH because it's so pH sensitive. If soils are looking more acidic, you will potentially get issues with nutrient deficiencies. Sugar beet always tends to show its deficiencies in going yellow. So in summary, pH problems means poorer nutrient availability, and we get this paler canopy. Stubby roots is a real characteristic part, though, of when we get pH problems, but it is easily confused with other issues. So just testing, making sure your pH is where it is really important. Target for beet is sitting sort of between 6.5 to 7.5. We want to sit around that 7, ideally, sit more to the alkaline side of things. And then if you acidify slightly through the rotation, it's not so bad. So liming and making your pH adjustments before beet is a great opportunity to do so. You will slip into some serious challenges when you start dropping below sort of 6.5. Observations from the beet yield challenge. You might think, why are we going about this? It's a real basic. It's something we all get right. Unfortunately, it's not. Of the 30 crops assessed in the 2017 beet yield challenge, there was some real variation. And I think what this highlights that's very interesting is obviously you do your W sampling or your grid sampling. We tend to mix that into a sample and say, well, our pH looks good. But actually, there's a lot of variation across fields. And I'm not saying go out and test, high res. We don't want to be out with a soil corer for hours on end. But maybe just thinking, if there's patches with a historical problem that you might have had poor beet 4 or 5 years ago or other crop issues, it might just be worth going to test pH in some patches and understanding if you have got some variation across the field, and just thinking about liming or correction in those really challenging areas as well. And like I said, beet is a great indicator of that because it is so pH sensitive. So I won't go on about this too much because you can see that we've spoken about it earlier, but I just wanted to revisit in the context of nitrogen cover crop nutrient release. As I highlighted, just thinking about biomass, method of destruction and timing of destruction, again, that massive variation in potential release. Best approach, and when I say best, it's still not ideal, is again, going out and measuring your soil nitrogen supply in February or March time. But again, by the time you've cultivated, you've had rainfall, it's a very variable measure. And actually, again, probably still quite challenging, but maybe worth doing if you do it every time that you have a cover crop in. You might get a long-term trend and collect that data, so it might be worth starting to collect that data now, so you have it for the future. Again, mentioned this to all of you when I did my cover crop talk, but I wanted to just show you some pictures and actually show you what we have been doing. So these are the cover crop strip trials that I mentioned to you all. Black oat and vetch mix, the radish and rye and the 6-way mix. There's a lot of evidence that 2 to 3 species in a cover crop mix is going to be optimal both for cost and effectiveness. But we did want to see if the 6-way mix did anything. And again, I mentioned it, so I won't go on about it in too much detail, but we will be measuring nitrate release and how the sugar beet crop performs after. Another common question we get is on placement fertilizer. There's a lot of people doing it successfully, but there's also a lot of probably slightly misled horror stories of people scorching their entire fields off. It has happened, but it tends to be because the placement kit hasn't been set up correctly. It can be safe when done well, and certainly brings some benefits. So when we're thinking about fertilizer placement, we're thinking about placing, so if this is your seed, 2 inches below and 2 inches to the side of the seed, or 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters. erring on the side of caution, you wanting to be slightly further away rather than slightly too close, just in case as the machine's working, you move within that tolerance. 40 to 60 kilos of N being placed at drilling is ideal, so your sort of classic initial rate. We have got some evidence that you can then reduce your rate. So if you're typically putting 120 on, going down to 100, or if you're putting 100 on, dropping sort of 80 or 90, can be very effective. And the biggest benefits you see are in the driest years. And for those of you that have as a tempo over there, are drilling maize and have a DAP setup, placing phosphate with nitrogen, shockingly, even in actually quite high phosphate soils in sugar beet does tend to have a benefit. Again, shouldn't be applying phosphate where your indices are excessively high, but it is an observation that we have. Touching on this as well, we are doing some fertilizer placement work. We've done one season of it so far. Really, we know it works. It's just revisiting proof of concept, also wanting to get you guys out to see it working in practice and see what works for you. And we and Stephen did decide to put all 100 kilos of N down the spout at drilling just to see, whether a hot mix really did have any issues. And it didn't. It performed exactly the same, actually, in that case, as the other treatments. And the Nordic countries, who pretty much universally place their fertilizer at drilling on their beet, they put all of their nitrogen down at drilling. So potentially one for the future, one for us to look at, which brings us on to products as well. So potentially some slower release nitrogen products might work better in that situation. But going back to sort of more conventional broadcasting approaches, there's a lot of fertilizers coming onto the market now that are organic matter based. So they're quite low N, they're sort of 10 to 12% nitrogen, but they have a slow release characteristic because they have a lot of basically carbon residue, and they're made out of an organic waste. So it might be cocoa husks, they're very similar to digestate pellets actually in a lot of ways. Some of them are digestate pellets as well. So I've just stood and done a whole talk on how we want to drive that canopy growth. We want maximum canopy cover by June. And then these slow release fertilizers are going to be great. That's what we want. So we had a little bit of concern over that, whether they do work with what we want out of sugar beet agronomy. So we've been doing some product trials, testing some of these products alongside obviously your typical on-farm AN and urea products. So we've just done 1 year of that as it stands. So the results of that will come through. But yeah, I can say initially that they seem to have performed quite well. They haven't driven up impurities or held the crop back in any way. But obviously it was quite an amenable season in that regard. So we had good rainfall. It was reasonably warm. So the breakdown of those pellets was quite quick. Be interesting to see if we have a drier spring this year, whether we see any differences there as well. So, and also I might as well mention it, they're quite expensive at the moment, these products. And because they're only sort of 10 to 12% N, you have to put about 600 kilos of product on per hectare. So the practicalities are a little bit behind perhaps where we actually want to be. So just something to consider, but something we're very much interested in, and make sure we generate that data. So if you guys are being approached to use some of these products, we'll have that data available for you to make a decision. Obviously, this is my pride and joy of this Beet Tech event, hence why I put it up on screen again and already mentioned it to you. But as we've just touched on, placement fertilizer we know works, but again, might be a bit of a challenge to adopt it on farm. You might be a bit hesitant. Great opportunity to do some of your own on-farm trials. Same with nitrogen rates. Maybe you want to go out and actually measure your SNS, adjust your nitrogen rates accordingly. I know it's a temptation because obviously the N we put on beet's a lot lower than, say, your cereal crops. So we sort of just put on our 100 or 120. But there really is evidence that we can drop those rates a bit, which is going to be without detriment to yield and obviously improving your margin. So it is something worth just having a little bit of a play with. And again, this gives you a way of doing it without taking too much risk on farm. And once again, please let us know how you get on if you want help with anything, if there's anything you want to discuss. It'd be great to work together with you guys and get some good, reliable on-farm data as well. So some key messages to take home. Ensure your pH is between 6.5 and 7.5, ideally drawing towards that 7, 7.5. Thinking about optimizing our fertilizer use through tailoring your recommendations to your specific circumstances. Thinking about placement, it is a good option. It can bring a yield benefit in most years. So starting that journey can be really good. Do remember that your varieties differ in leaf greenness. It's not a late season N requirement. They're just different. And conduct some on-farm trials and see what works for you. And let us know how you get on. So that is everything from me. Thank you very much. I'll now pass on to Susanna, who's going to talk about her new work.